Welcome to our next panel on the Climate Essay and Conference. I'm thrilled to welcome the audience to this session, Confronting Climate Security Risks, Proposals for the Biden Administration. Climate change is often referred to as a threat multiplier. It is destabilizing regions around the globe and challenging stable governance. We know the Biden administration has acknowledged this and has made dealing with climate change a priority. In this session, we'll be discussing what the Biden administration must do to anticipate and mitigate climate security risks and avoid catastrophic outcomes. We invite you to direct any questions you have for our panelists by typing them into this chat. Make sure to include your name, your organization, and the speaker to whom you're addressing your question to. We'll direct these questions to our panelists in the Q&A portion at the end of our session. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, the Honorable Joan Conger. Joan is the director of the Center for Climate and Security. Joan previously served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense. Before his appointment to the DoD, Joan served for 12 years on legislative staffs in the U.S. Congress. Welcome, Joan, to this panel. Please, your remarks.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me inviting me to participate on this panel today. I'm the director of the Center for Climate and Security, and as a consequence, let me tell you a little bit about the center, and then we'll sort of get into what the recommendations are. The Center for Climate and Security is a small think tank based in Washington that's focused on bringing attention to the security threats and risks associated with climate change, and sort of urging the government to take commensurate action. In 2019, we collected a large group of retired military generals and admirals and other experts to pull together a report we called the Climate Security Plan for America. We sort of had timed it so that it would influence and inform the presidential campaigns, and I think we were pretty successful. I will make the observation that the Biden campaign incorporated some of the thoughts that we published into its campaign plans. And so from the outset, it wasn't a matter of waiting until the administration. It wasn't the only campaign that adopted some of our provisions, by the way. But from the outset, we were trying to influence and get this on people's radars. The Climate Security Plan for America had, dozens of military security or military experts and climate experts on its endorsing its recommendations, including 8 former 4-star generals and admirals, Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So we had very high level buy-in to what we were suggesting. We had 4 main pillars. The first one was to demonstrate leadership. It had to come from the White House and from the president in order to be able to make change really last and really be impactful. We suggested that the change that we needed to leverage the unprecedented foresight that we have on climate change. We can see these changes coming and these threats coming. And so we need to leverage that. We need to do planning. We need to do assessments and understand what our actions need to be. We need to support our partners and allies. This is a global effort, not just a one country effort. And frankly, every single nation is going to look at this threat and these risks differently. And they're going to see it through the lens of their own security strategy and their own geography and all the impacts they're seeing and the impacts their interests are seeing. And then finally, the sort of last section of our plan was focusing on preparing for and preventing the impacts of climate change. And so in all through a security lens. And so in that context, we talked about making infrastructure resilient, talked about adjusting and planning for missions that we are going to have, new missions that we might have because of climate change. And then also preventing those future impacts through some sort of holistic global reduction in emissions. We recognized from a security perspective that that was necessary in order to avoid future security impacts. So that's sort of the big picture that we had. and I can go into individual recommendations, but holistically, those were the main pieces. If you look at what the administration has done already, I think that echoes the themes that we presented. So before even they took office, the Biden administration appointed former Secretary Kerry to be the climate envoy, gave him a seat on the National Security Council, elevating the importance of climate change in the national security conversation. On day one, the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Agreement, saying this is a matter of utmost importance. On day 7 of the new administration, they issued an executive order 14008, and it was called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. In that executive order signed by President Biden, it stated that climate change is an essential element of foreign policy and national security, and it needs to be integrated into all the parts of the operation. On day 43, the administration issued interim national security guidance, a new sort of a national security strategy before the final one comes out. But it stated that in addition to the normal threats that we look at through our national security strategy, those threats without boundaries or that ignored boundaries, things like climate change and pandemics and cyber threats and so on, needed to be incorporated into the national security picture. On day 93, the Biden administration hosted an unprecedented gathering here in Washington to elevate ambition on climate, and in particular, there was a very high-level climate security conversation as part of that gathering, led by the Secretary of Defense, by the Director of National Intelligence, and by the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. So this gathering, clearly, all of these pieces clearly demonstrate leadership, clearly demonstrate the White House wants to focus on the climate impacts on national security. And so now the question is, now what, right? What's next? They've already adopted some of the recommendations we had, so what's next? I think that they really need to focus on 3 main areas that I think sort of go through multiple recommendations in our report, but are fundamental to the road forward. The first one is they need to come up with their roadmaps. They need strategies and plans and metrics. The executive order was good, and it's outlined many things that were necessary, but it is in effect a plan to plan. And so you have to come up with the actual plans that the staff will execute, how they're going to be measured, and how they'll be managed going forward. So that's one piece. The second piece they're going to need are the personnel in place. They have had 3 high-level Defense Department nominees confirmed. They need a lot more. And so until you get the politicals in place, you're not going to get the leadership you need to make change. And then the last thing is resources. The budget's going to come out in a couple weeks, or a week and a half. And that budget has to reflect their ambition. They have to resource their ambition. And so I'm happy to answer questions on any and all of these things, but that's sort of the next set of steps we're hoping for from the Biden administration going forward. And then the next 3.5 years, we'll see how that unfolds. So thanks very much for having me here today. Happy to answer any questions.
That's great, John. Thank you so much. And I'm sure many questions will be coming your way. Thank you for being engaged. To the audience, please put your questions in the chat for John Conger and the rest of our panelists. We will get to the next 2, and then we will have Q&A. And remember to use the hashtag ClimateSAN and share this information widely with your audiences. That's the goal, is to get this out there to those who need to hear it the most. So I now next would like to turn to our second panelist, Joan VanDervort. Ms. VanDervort is a member of the Climate and Security Advisory Group, a nonpartisan group of US-based national security and foreign policy experts that John so eloquently described to us. She is also a member of the International Military Council on Climate and Security and the former Deputy Director of Ranges, Sea, and Airspace at the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Joan. Great to see you.
It's great to see you too, Sweta, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you, John, for those comments on the climate security plan for America. And what I would like to do is just go into a little bit more detail about that plan and how we looked at the main drivers for that. So climate change is by far one of the greatest challenges that we face today. It's reshaping our entire geostrategic landscape and also creating a national security threat that poses catastrophic consequences over the next 2 decades, from agricultural disruptions and forced displacements to extreme heat and severe weather events. New and evolving risks are shaping the security environment, including our relationships with our allies and partners, as well as near-peer competitors and non-state actors in ways that are destabilizing. Well, climate change isn't a separate national security threat, and it shouldn't be tackled in isolation. Its impacts are complex and far-reaching, as they can both exacerbate and accelerate other security threats. Climate change factors such as sea level rise and severe weather events, inland flooding, and wildfires threaten critical infrastructure, which underpins the national security of the United States, our allies, and the readiness of our armed forces. It is also a driver in instability by stressing critical resources such as food, energy, and water. Well, in light of those unprecedented national security threats, as John had mentioned, we had a need as our nation to have a holistic response, and that is why we put together 64 senior military, national security, and intelligence leaders of the Climate and Security Advisory Group, which I was a part of, chaired by the Center for Climate and Security, to release this plan in September of 2019. And that plan called on the president not only to recognize climate change as a critical national security threat, but to embark on a national strategy to prepare and prevent the impacts of that threat. Well, our plan offers an ambitious blueprint that lays out concrete and robust actions that can be taken by the administration to respond to adverse impacts of climate change. It's based, as John said, on 4 pillars: leadership, assessing those risks, supporting our allies and partners by bolstering climate resilience abroad, and preparing and preventing climate impacts at home. Our plan calls on the administration to make climate change a vital national security priority. And our top recommendations under the first pillar included appointing that standard bearer with the ear to the president and the National Security Council, and integrating climate change into the new national security strategy. Biden administration has stepped forward on those key recommendations under this pillar by putting climate change on par with threats from China and Russia in the new interim national security strategy, as well as appointing John Kerry to be climate envoy, and of course, rejoining the Paris Agreement. Well done. Our second set of recommendations focused on assessing climate risk, ensuring leaders have the information and data that they need to effectively take into action, from prioritizing intelligence assessments on climate security and establishing an interagency climate security crisis watch center, which would strengthen the intelligence community's ability to analyze and warn of climate threats. It also included recommendations to assess the vulnerabilities of critical civilian and military infrastructure, as well as the Defense Department's military mission. Our third pillar focused on supporting our allies and partners in rebuilding resiliency to climate security threats. The resiliency of our partners and allies to climate change is critical to our national security, as those vulnerabilities constrain their governments and contribute to conflict and instability. Our top recommendation for the administration is to task the National Security Advisor to create regional climate security plans, unified interagency plans at the very highest that support foreign policy and national security in critical regions of the world, such as the Arctic, Asia Pacific, and Africa, to bolster resilience and prevent climate stress from these fragile countries. Our last set of recommendations focused on building resilience at home, and in particular, the long-term resilience of its critical infrastructure. Key recommendation is the creation of an initiative that would make major new investments in both critical civilian and military infrastructure. Our national security also depends on the readiness of our armed forces, and that readiness is directly linked to critical infrastructure that includes its ranges and training land. For those who don't know, the Department of Defense manages a global real estate portfolio with an estimated replacement value of almost $1.2 trillion that spans 156 countries, that support services, ability to project power and rapidly respond to global threats, often in unpredictable operational environments. And those operational environments are not only being rapidly reshaped by climate change, but it has a potential for impacting the readiness of the force. Just within the last 5 years, DoD has seen a bruising impact of severe weather on its critical infrastructure, training and test ranges from severe and more frequent weather events, sea level rise, inland flooding, wildfires, and the loss of permafrost fueled by climate change. And the cost has been staggering, now well over $10 billion, and it has significantly impacted operations, training, deployments, and ship qualifications. Well, large-scale repair and damage to infrastructure, ranges, and training land doesn't happen overnight, and that can compromise readiness. We also included under this pillar a recommendation to prepare for new threats and missions. The convergence of emerging theaters of operation, climate change, and existing challenges to readiness is being played out right now in the Arctic, where melting ice is changing the very geostrategic landscape of the region. Russia is heavily investing in the Arctic, projecting an investment of $80 billion over the next 5 years. They are also rapidly militarizing the northern flank of the region and positioning cruise missiles at choke points. At the same time, China is expanding its influence in the Arctic as they pursue a new Northwest Passage, the Polar Silk Road. At the same time, climate change is impacting both operations and military training in Alaska, one of the most strategically important locations that we have in the US, from wildfires and coastal erosion, inland flooding, and the loss of permafrost, which has severely damaged critical infrastructure, training facilities, equipment, and cut off access to and limited the use of maneuver training areas, all of which has an impact on readiness. Well, the US will need to be prepared for rapidly changing geostrategic conditions in the Arctic, and the readiness of all the services to operate and deter aggression in this region is critical. Since the release of our plan, the services have each issued their own Arctic strategies, and this is an important first step in establishing a much needed overarching national security policy for the Arctic, which will provide a holistic approach to and help guide resiliency. And thank you so very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Joan, for putting all of that forward. I'm sure that is a lot of content for the audience to process. And please remember to think of your questions, put them in the chat, and direct them to the speaker that you would like to have answer. Our next panelist, before we go to questions, is Captain Steve Brock. Captain Brock is a senior advisor with the Council on Strategic Risks and at the Center for Climate and Security, as well as Chief of Staff to the Chair and Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. During his career, Captain Brock has served in a variety of capacities within the U.S. Department of Defense and the White House, as well as in a number of senior capacities at the U.S. military. Welcome, Steve. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor to be on your panel and to be sharing views with John and Joan. I'm going to frame my comments in the context of four major Biden administration initiatives. The first is global leadership, reasserting U.S. global leadership. The second is Build Back Better. The third is conservation, the Biden administration's conservation policies. And finally, in the sort of overarching, most important is the Biden administration's focus on leading on climate and dealing it with as the existential threat that it is. In the context of all of that, I'm going to be mainly looking at national security through the lens of the U.S. Department of Defense, but also all of its federal partners and international allies and partners. The first point I'd like to make is that the Department of Defense and of course the State Department and USAID have a tremendous number of programs and partnerships around the world that are very closely related to the things that we could actually help them on environmentally, climate related, in the regions of the world that are most threatened by climate change. Those are all existing authorities. Those are all programs that have been in place. And with a slight tweak to have a climate focus to them, we can move out on those very quickly. The second point I'd like to make is DoD's tremendous market influence across a whole spectrum. And this ties into the Biden administration's Build Back Better initiatives to revive the American economy. First of all, as we all know, the Pentagon has tens of thousands of supply chains across a whole host of products that if given a demand signal to provide sustainable, climate smart supply chains and products would have a major impact throughout the American economy. Secondly, DoD with the budget that it has tremendous buying power in the acquisition sphere. And so the ability to acquire large scale weapon systems and other equipment that's needed by our forces in a climate smart way will not only enhance jobs throughout every congressional district in America, but also will get at the climate problem in a very scalable way. Thirdly, DoD, as Joan had mentioned, has a 27 million acre portfolio. And if you combine that 27 million acres with the other federal partners DoD has as far as land use in the 48 and in Alaska and Hawaii, and even abroad, but mainly in the domestic sphere, the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service add about another 500 million acres to that mix, many of which is leased to DoD for training or overflight purposes. If you took that scale of landscape and you climate optimized it, not only would you create a powerful carbon sink, but you would also really enhance training readiness, space resilience, all of the things that you would do to optimize it for climate performance would also reduce drought, reduce wildfire, increase water quality, reduce erosion, sea level rise, et cetera. So there is a very powerful resilience and operational readiness and training component to better optimizing the landscapes that the federal government has for climate purposes. Secondly, another asset that DoD has beyond its market scale and the amount of partners it has and the amount of land that it has under its control and its international presence around the globe is its position within American society. DoD installations are located in all ecosystems in the United States, alongside all kinds of communities, large and small, urban and rural. And those bases don't exist as an island on their own. The workforce resides in the communities, utilities come from the communities, It's a symbiotic relationship outside the fence line and inside the fence line. So DoD at the installation level is very well positioned to be the eyes and ears of what actually is needed in local communities and in the local environmental context that the bases are in for the best climate solutions. And that information, of course, in a two-way flow between Washington and the local level is invaluable. So one of my very strong recommendations is to empower regional commanders, installation commanders to provide feedback on what works for them back up to the federal government. And of course, we all know about DoD's number of vehicles, the amount of fuel it uses, the number of facilities it has, all ties into its ability to work with private industry and make R&D breakthroughs that could advance markets and have a major impact on the U.S. economy, and also our competitiveness with peer competitors, especially in the production of batteries and other renewable energy technology that is going to be dominating the global marketplace in the decades to come. And my final point would be in the intelligence sphere. DoD is a major component of the intelligence community. DoD is the preponderance of the agencies, the preponderance of the budget, the preponderance of the technical assets that we use, both aircraft, satellites, a whole host of technical assets. Those assets, could be used for climate and environmental purposes, especially those assets that are functioning in various spectrum, the hyperspectral range, et cetera, to report back on climate health abroad, ecosystem health abroad, and in the United States to do some of the projects that I've already laid out for climate optimization of federal lands. But also DoD has a very strong influence in being able to work with the rest of the intelligence community to move up climate-related intelligence collection priorities up the ladder to where they need to be to deal with this existential threat and not languishing towards the bottom of the list as they have for decades. If you do that, you will over time create that basis of collection material, that basis of analysis, and that basis of expertise throughout the intelligence community to make really good decisions on climate and security that we currently don't have the capacity to do because we're not mature in that area after years of not emphasizing it. And I will cede the remainder of my my time back to the chair for questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we are now at the question and answer portion. So thank you, Steve. Thank you to all of our panelists. If you haven't done so already, to the audience, please type in your questions in the chat. We have several that have already come through, so we're going to get going on those straight away. But if you would like to add some additional questions in, please make sure you include your name, your organization, and the speaker you are addressing the question to. And to the speakers, we can get through more questions if you can keep your responses to 2 to 3 minutes. So with that, let's begin with a question for John. So John, when you began your presentation, you were talking about the need to come up with a roadmap. So what should be the first stop on that map? Or put in another way, what is the most critical thing that the administration should be doing right now?
So if I had to, it's not sexy, I will say it straight out, but the answer is planning. It is important when you get ready to take on a major effort to go sort of ready, aim, fire, rather than ready, fire, aim. You want to think the problem through and figure out the list of actions before you start spending money. We've had way too many problems that we've decided to throw money at without necessarily thinking through what the steps are, because in every location, the solutions are going to be different. There's not a one size fits all. We're going to have to think about this at a variety of locations, at a variety of missions, and it's going to require that sort of forethought before you get running. So right now, the planning's the first thing. But I'll add one more thing. The budget's going to come out here in a couple of weeks. And in that budget, they're going to need to add resources for people in order to execute your ambition. And this is all about the department, or the administration has this huge ambition. But in order to fulfill it, they need to resources it, and they need to plan for it. So they need the people, they need the planning, and then they're going to need, you know, the actual money. But the money is going to come later, I think. It's one more step past.
And John, in a conversation I heard through the Center for Climate and Security that you held recently, you also talked about some key personnel roles that still need to be filled as well. Would you say that that is also a priority?
Yes. When I was in the department, one of the jobs I had, I was the acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Installations and Environment. So I had responsibility for all the installations, all the energy policy, all the environmental policy in the Department of Defense. There's no nominee for that job right now. And so that's still pending. There's the military services, the Army, Navy, Air Force have sort of parallel positions. Only one of those has been nominated so far. So I think there's a long way to go before you get the political leadership in. And frankly, you can't expect the civilian leadership to lean forward like a political person will. And so the folks who are acting in those jobs are not going to be as ambitious, and they're going to be a little more hesitant. And so in order to get up to full speed, you need your leadership people in their positions.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So we heard you loud and clear, planning and personnel. And as Alice Hill said as well, there's more climate in the titles of these jobs in this administration than any previous administration. So that's a step in the right direction.
Yes.
Okay, Joan, for you, you talked about some of the great challenges that we're facing now, and one being that there's a new ocean opening up. The Arctic is now being able to be navigated in a way that previously wasn't the case, thanks to the planet warming. So this enables oceanic trade in greater volumes that can be passed through canals. One of our audience members is asking, is it not more beneficial to be developing economies and their security? It's not more beneficial to be developing economies and their security to have these ice caps melt. So how do we not see this as a positive potentially? And how do we redirect that narrative? Joan, you're muted. Sorry, if you don't mind, please unmuting. Sorry. The world of Zoom.
Right, okay, the world of Zoom. But I was going to say, there are pros and cons, definitely, of the Arctic opening up, and certainly the Arctic has just a massive amount of natural resources, also mineral resources, and I think that if you look at the Arctic Council, that has been in place for a while time, and that will be a council that as we go into the future, that I think that we need to rely on, and the relationships that we have with other members of the Arctic Council to put into place policy, overarching policy within the Arctic, that all these nations can come together to work in this area peacefully and to ensure the conservation of natural resources, but to also open up the economy as well.
That's great. Thank you for that. Steve, I think you're off video, but if you could please come back. We have a question for you. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, feel free, everybody, please feel free to stay in the Q&A session. We have a few more questions for you that I'll be throwing at each of you, and about 7 minutes left. So Steve, this one is for you. Speaking of the Department of Defense's land portfolio, what role do you see for coordination between, let's say, DOD and other federal agencies like the USDA? And related to that, how does the President's executive order on climate implicate the Department of Defense? That's a question from the audience.
Well, as far as cooperation with the other federal agencies on federal lands, of course, there is strictly applicable to those that DoD has, taken for permanent use through a lease permitting process or taken out of the public domain from BLM. But there's also a much broader impact that could be had. if the practices that were, that were initiated on DoD lands were transferred to, the hundreds of millions of acres that are under Department of Interior and USDA. I had referred earlier to some intelligence uses of hyperspectral, both air breather and overhead imaging and climate optimization of DoD's lands. That data could be collected rapidly at a great and tremendous precision, far better than anything that currently exists, in the rest of the federal government or in academia or elsewhere, and can be shared with the other agencies. And one kind of far-reaching, ambitious example would be to use that data to help USDA realize its carbon banking initiative through the Commodity Credit Corporation, and reimbursing farmers for stewardship of their lands. But you need to be able to collect that data at rapid scale, and that's something that DoD could pilot with the federal government on DoD lands using intelligence community assets, and then find ways through the civil applications authorities to transfer that to USDA and to supercharge it across the rest of the country as far as those programs go. And there's also quite a bit that can be done on bases from both a gray infrastructure and a greening infrastructure perspective to, like I said in my comments, enhance operational readiness, but also enhance, the quality of life for the folks that are training there and that are living there. The EO implicates DoD in many ways. It requires all the federal agencies to put these plans together and to make it a core mission, and to report back in 120 days on their initial outline of their plans, get feedback from the National Climate Advisors team, and then there's going to be, as John pointed out, an iteration of planning, and then implementation programs after that.
Can I do a two-finger on that just real quick?
Please.
So the Department of Defense has an incredible relationship with the Department of Interior and the USDA. We work very closely together, and I would like to highlight one example. There's a program we started when I was there called Sentinel Landscapes, where DoD and DOI and USDA share funds to conserve land around DoD bases and in the environment around DoD bases. And it's closely related to another program DoD has called the Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program. But they all work together and pool funds to conserve land around DoD bases. And everybody's doing it for their own reasons. There might be some folks with conservation goals, and DoD might want buffer land around its bases so it can do training. But they all work together, and they work together very well.
Thank you for that.
And if I could just add to that real quick, so those lands should be considered potentially part of the Biden administration's Conservation 30 by 30 program to conserve 30% of U.S. lands. Those lands should be considered, in my opinion.
Thank you. Okay. You can tell that we all chat on this pretty frequently. So there's a lot we want to share. And again, everyone, please, we still have 2 more questions, but this really is some incredible content that wider audiences are not necessarily privy to. So please take advantage and follow the work that's being done at the center and share this content widely with your networks and under the hashtag ClimateSAN. And you can see all of this and more at the Center for Climate and Security website. Joan, a question for you that has come in is on the future of nuclear energy. Many plants have been shut down. So how is that going to, and obviously this isn't a question to be answered in a minute, but just your thoughts on where nuclear is going to play a role in reaching net zero in Biden's administration?
I'm going to hand that question off to Steve or John, because I think that they may be able to answer that better than I can at this point.
Who would like to take the hot potato? John?
So I'll do it real quick. First of all, how we get down to zero holistically through the economy is not necessarily a security enterprise function. DoD will do some work with nuclear. There's some projects that we're working on, but that's not what's going to take us down to zero. The Department of Energy is going to have the lead on a lot of this rather than the Department of Defense.
Okay. And to ask you another question about a specific sector, what about shale? What about oil? What about fracking? And so if the US stops producing and consuming shale gas, then doesn't that just raise global oil prices? Isn't that something that we should be concerned about from a national security perspective?
Look, they're going to bring they're going to have a holistic strategy to bring everything down to zero. And there will undoubtedly be security implications from all the efforts to reduce emissions, whether it's rare earth elements or geoengineering or or the oil economy. All of those things are going to have security implications, and we'll have to watch that as we move forward. But it's also the case that if we do nothing, the security costs will be extraordinary and catastrophic. And so, you know, there may be some other things, the unanticipated consequences we have to watch for, but we should watch for them as we move forward.
Thank you. That was said perfectly, perfectly handled. These are not easy questions, of course, and we're talking about major issues related to climate change and national security, and the work that all of you do at the center and beyond is incredibly impactful and critical, and thank you for giving us not just your expertise, but your time today. Much appreciated. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, John. Thank you, Steve. Please continue the great work, and thank you to the audience for staying engaged with us today. Thank you, everyone.